The world of portraiture in the Tudor period may seem far removed from the sphere of religious painting, which after 50 years of intensive production from 1485 ceased stage by stage from 1534 in the English Reformation. However, when this early 16th century portrait, which we've already seen, of Henry VII came to the Hamilton Kerr Institute in 2007, later restorations were removed to reveal an original scheme of barber's pole decoration and bright reds and greens in counterpoint. It underlined a connection, a shared visual language, with the largest surviving body of 15th and 16th century religious painting in England, the rood screens of East Anglia. It's well established that the destruction of religious objects and paintings under Henry VIII and Edward VI was systematic and devastating. What was revived or emerged from hiding under Mary was then either defaced or destroyed under Elizabeth, or later during the Civil War and parliamentary period. Taken together, England's iconoclasms were so far-reaching that despite the fact that every parish had a medieval rood or crucifix on top of their rood screen, only a handful of fragmentary survivors are known, such as the Cartmel Fell Christ. Therefore, unlike roods and portable paintings such as altarpieces, painted screens comprise a surprisingly large body of extant pre-Reformation art. There are more than 500 screens or fragments within the historical boundaries of Cambridgeshire, Norfolk and Suffolk, the medieval dioceses of Norwich and Ely. Of the three counties, Norfolk is richest, with 275 surviving screens or fragments. While many East Anglian screens have since been stripped of their paint, numerous figurative and decorative schemes still remain. Nearly 120 screens retain their painted figures, usually of saints, but also including prophets, kings and angels, as well as representations of donor figures. Near ubiquitous by the 15th century, rood screens were previously part of a larger, varied ensemble, of which much has been destroyed. Specifically, the Great Crucifix or rood, its attendant figures, and the rood loft. They were not termed screens until the late 16th century, following the removal of their roods and lofts. Until the Reformation, they were known as rood lofts, perks, or candle beams. No single term fully conveys both what is left now and what was intended originally, so rood screen or chancel screen, both equally problematic terms, will have to do. Rood screens demarcated and separated the nave from the chancel, the public part of the church from that of the priest, the profane from the holy, the earthly from the divine. Far from being a practical physical barrier, they acted more as a spiritual one and as a frame for the theatre of the Mass. They were multivalent, multifunctional structures replete with meaning. Establishing a secure chronology for East Anglian screens is complex. Some dates can be found in inscriptions on screens, also in records of inscriptions collected by antiquaries such as Norfolk's Bloomfield, and also in wills bequeathing money to their construction and painting. As chancel screens were large, expensive composite structures, they were often the product of parish fundraising and could take decades to complete. For example, at Courtauld in Norfolk, the first known bequest to the screen is in 1460 and the last in 1507. Where screens are dated by painted inscription, this marks the end of a long story of construction and decoration, which were separate processes involving distinct craftsmen. This separation of the crafts can be seen most clearly at St Catherine's Fritton in Norfolk, where the painters have had to respond to the unfinished tracery carving by cramming St Jude beneath an uncarved tracery head. And he's really quite short as well. There's a significant change in woodworking technique, which helps the dating of screens and which can assist in dating undated examples. Tim Howson, in his 2009 study of the woodwork of Suffolk screens, was the first to note that there are two main approaches to jointing the junction between transom and stanchion on 15th and 16th century perpendicular style screens in East Anglia. And I hope you can see this. The joints are here and here. After surveying about 40 Norfolk and Suffolk screens and comparing them to known and dated will bequests, Tim Howson concluded that mason's mitre joints, an earlier joint type, were superseded by scribed joints. In a mason's mitre joint, the two members being joined meet as for a butt joint, but a small section of one member is removed, forming a socket into which the end of the other fits. In the case of a mason's mitre on a screen, the mouldings are returned on the stanchion. So here they align, in order to align with the transom mouldings. In scribed joints on screens, the transom piece is carved to align with the upright mouldings of the upright pier, and there's little or no return for the mouldings on the pier. So it comes down in this line here. The scribed joint is a better solution to joining transom to stanchion. It's quicker to make and also probably replace the mason's mitre system because unlike the mason's mitre, it does not open up as the wood shrinks across the grain over time. The scribed joint disguises this shrinkage. I've been able to test and expand upon Howson's work and have compiled about 100 datable surviving screens thus far from will dates and site visits. I've used statistical methods to examine the data, which shows that the scribe jointing technique superseded Mason's mitre jointing methods around 1485. It also indicates that there was a period between the two techniques when hybrid joints are found, and these are essentially scribe joints with a small Mason's mitre return, such as this one. You can see it slight carving to align with the transom there. So the scribed transom to stanchion joint was first used in the 1480s and was used invariably after 1505. The period from circa 1480 until circa 1500 was one where both jointing techniques were used, as well as a hybridised version of the two, with the scribed joint finding increasing favour. Therefore, an undated East Anglian screen with scribed joints is likely to have been made circa 1485 to 1536. An undated perpendicular screen with mason's mitre joints probably dates earlier, from between 1400 to 1505. This transition coincides with the beginning of the Tudor period, and so a study of scribe jointed screens and of their painted schemes is effectively a study of Tudor screens. I'm therefore going to concentrate the first part of this talk on figurative screens of the Tudor period, scribe jointed screens, and on those hybrid and mason's mitre jointed screens with Tudor period will bequest dates. I'll compare the painting on Tudor screens with that from circa 1400 until 1480 to see whether there are any definable differences. And in the second part of the talk, I will describe what happened to rood lofts from 1534 until the Elizabethan period. Once the compartmentalised perpendicular screen had come into being in the early 15th century, its decoration followed quite clearly defined patterns and traditions until the Reformation. Carving and construction was done in oak, with at least some of the carving being finished on site. Once the work of the carpenters was complete, painting was undertaken as and when funds permitted. Although many screens are now stripped of their original paint, in over 300 surveyed examples, fragments of paint have been found on all but a couple of screens. As no contracts for screen painting survive, it is not known whether carpenters or carvers subcontracted work out to painters, or whether the choice of painters lay with the patrons, but the latter is more likely. The evidence suggests that the two crafts were very much separate. Careful recording of certain aspects of screens, such as the jointing methods and the transom moulding profile, also distinct carved motifs and tracery patterns at dado heads and bases, and also the upper fenestration, makes for meaningful and close comparison between screen structures. When several features correlate, the evidence points to a shared workshop origin. There are many carpentry groupings throughout the period of screens, and to give one example, Yaxley and I in Suffolk ascribe jointed screens which share enough points of comparison to ascribe them to the same carpenters. Examination of the surviving paintings in East Anglia also reveals that many were painted by the same workshops. As many as 13 groups of related works have been identified, and there probably are more. Comparison can be made of repeat techniques, such as stencils, and also tin relief patterns, as well as on stylistic ground. And where sets of stencils or tin relief patterns are found to be the same, it's clear that the same teams of artists are operating. While groupings of related screens can be found both in terms of carpentry and of painting, there's little overlap between those screens which resemble each other structurally and those whose painting is from the same workshop. The painting of screens from circa 1400 until the beginning of the Tudor period followed a fairly standard model with slight variations or signature features found between different workshops. Screens were usually covered with a white chalk ground bound in animal glue, sometimes followed by lead white priming and subsequent layers in drying oil. The mullions and upper fenestration were often painted in white, red and green and gilded, and the mouldings framing the dado panels decorated with floral patterns and barber's pole decoration. Blue pigments were used for the canopy of the loft, which in surviving examples is often star-studded or angel-bedecked. Underdrawing was usually undertaken using a carbon black medium. The backgrounds of the figure panels were decorated alternately in copper green and vermilion, and these were in turn decorated with stencils in gold and sometimes silver, which is typically now tarnished to black. Figure painting was usually fairly calligraphic in tone, with flesh paint outlined in brown or black. The limited modelling of form was often done in highlights and glazes over mid-tones. Tudor screens have much the same structure and broadly the same materials and handling of ornamental detailing as their predecessors. However, during the 15th and 16th centuries, England was very open to artistic influences, especially from the Low Countries and Rhine, both from imported works of art and imported artists. This influence came to be reflected in both the iconography and style of painting on rood screens by circa 1500. East Anglia was especially influenced due to its geographical position, facing across the sea towards the Burgundian Netherlands, and also because of its wealth and involvement in the cloth trade. Cloth superseded wool as England's main export by the mid-15th century. White cloths were exported to Antwerp, where they were finished. Goods were also imported into England. Links were especially strong with Antwerp, which received between 35 and 40% of English cloth between 1440 and 1480, doubling between 1500 and 1550. Antwerp was also a leading centre for artistic production and export. During the 15th and early 16th centuries, records show that numerous small-scale ready-made works of art were imported into England. There was a strong English market for Flemish books of hours, and it has been shown that they were particularly popular in East Anglia, in part due to their physical proximity. The influence of Flemish books of hours can be seen as early as circa 1460 here at Barton Turf. Yet towards the latter end of production and decoration of rood screens, from around 1500, a notable and widespread shift in design appears to have taken place, powerfully influenced by continental print sources. Landscape and ideas of recessional space became an increasing factor in panel compositions, and narrative scenes rather than iconic saints increased in popularity. Screen designers and carpenters accommodated for this by widening the dado panels, and sometimes no longer subdividing them, as here at Wellingham. It was Byam Shaw who first noted that the St Andrew and the St Peter on the screen at Worcester were derived from Schongauer prints, or rather through copies such as Israel von Mekenham's, perhaps in a format similar to this broadside. John Mitchell identified the St Simon on the Worcester screen as coming from a Lucas van Leyden St Peter. The Lucas van Leyden Apostle series dates to circa 1510. The worsted screen is dated 1512 and must have appeared strikingly contemporary. E.F. Strange noted that the Lucas van Leyden influenced Tacklestone panel in 1901, and John Mitchell identified an Annunciation by monogrammist F.V.B. as the source for the other surviving Tacklestone panel. Pauline Plummer noted that a composition of James the Less by the Master of the Banderolles is used for a panel of St Bartholomew at Corston, and in addition, this Israel von Mekenham print seems to have influenced the depiction of St Thomas in related screens at Walpole St Peter and Beeston Regis. Once print sources became popular as an inspiration for panel composition, the use of alternating green and red backgrounds adorned with stencils declined, replaced instead by landscapes and also by gilded cloths of honour. Where red and green stencil backgrounds were retained, they were turned into cloths of honour, sometimes held by angels behind the saints. By the 16th century, there are even instances of portraiture on screens, as at North Tuddenham, where, as I've shown, the figure of St Sebastian is painted in a likeness of Henry VII. As well as changes in painting style, there are some alterations in painting technique. This mainly manifests itself in the increased use of modelling, as can be seen when comparing Carlton Road and Bramfield. This change can even be seen within the same workshop when comparing the handling of St Philip's basket of bread at Ramworth and on the later screen at Southwold. Eamon Duffy's shown that the years 1490 to 1520 were the most active for rood loft donations in Norfolk and Suffolk. Bequeathing money for the production of perks was popular right up until the Reformation, and the slight reduction in bequests between 1520 and 1540 probably indicates that by this date most churches had completed the construction and decoration of their screens, rather than being a sign of impending reform. However, reform came and the production of rood lofts ceased. The dissolution officially sanctioned the destruction, dismantling, and sometimes sale of the fittings of monastic churches, including screens and lofts. From 1536, this was coupled with the destruction of cult images in conventual and parochial settings. Despite this, the building of parochial rood lofts continued well into the reign of Henry VIII, as shown by documentary and physical remains. At Wellingham, the screen is inscribed 1532. And a sizable bequest was left by John James to make the rood loft as late as 1538 in Banham in Norfolk. In other counties, records show that rood lofts were made as late as 1546. However, the troubled climate of the latter 1530s had already led to a reduction in lay donations to roods and rood lofts under Henry VIII. While the 1536 royal injunctions had criticised the cult of images, relics and pilgrimage, those 2 years later were more forceful. The 1538 injunctions forbade pilgrimage, an outward manifestation of devotion to the cult of the saints and the dead. However, tapers and candles were still permitted to be burnt before the Great Rood, and there was to be no officially sanctioned destruction of the rood or any part of its supporting structure at that date, although attacks did take place between 1538 and 1540. By the death of Henry VIII in January 1547, the pilgrimage sites, the shrines of saints and the entire monastic system had been taken apart. The building of rood lofts had slowed in pace, and those in the monastic setting had been sold or destroyed. It was under Edward VI that the building of lofts was fully halted, images attacked and roods burnt. The injunctions of 1547 led to royal visitations from September. While the visitations prompted the widespread destruction of many images, the distinction between a used and a misused image was not clarified until the end of 1547. The official order to remove all images from London came first and was extended by Cranmer to the rest of the country in February of the following year. From that point on, all images were to be removed from churches and destroyed. The campaign lasted many years. By 1550, ownership of religious images could lead to fines and imprisonment. The iconoclasm of roods and rood groups was so successful that only 5 or so fragments of British roods have survived. Rood beams, such as this one at Tunstead in Norfolk, are more common in their survival, although where figurative or naturalistic they too suffered destruction. A sole surviving Golgotha beam remains in Columpton in Devon. Under Edward VI, screens themselves were retained and acquired a new function. Where the rood, these are a bit later, but where the rood and its attendant figures had once stood, royal arms were now positioned. However, it was not until the reign of Elizabeth that rood lofts, in the modern understanding of the term, the parapets, were officially condemned. Clearly, in a time of great turmoil and without official sanction, some reformers, such as Bishop Hooper in 1551-52, sought and succeeded in the abolition of some rood lofts. The reign of Mary saw the restoration of rood groups, as at Ludham in Norfolk, restored to the Chancel Arch after its discovery in the rood stair in a very fruitful 1879 Archaeological Society outing, is this wooden tympanum. On the chancel side of the arch, an Elizabethan royal arms on canvas is visible. Now reinstated to face the nave at Ludham is the earlier tympanum, with Mary in reworking, which was once covered by the Elizabethan arms. The older tympanum was somehow retained through the 1530s, perhaps in the hope it would one day be put back. And this was most probably the medieval tympanum, prior to the removal of roods in the reign of Edward. Not all the paint is Marian. That the tympanum is older is shown by the fact that the figure of Christ and the cross was rather crudely added over blank space on the tympanum, previously hidden by statuary of the same subject. At Foxley in Norfolk, the upper part of the screen is sawn from the dado, but reattached with hand-forged iron strapwork. Although Foxley's Church Guide states that this rejoining occurred in the reign of Elizabeth, it may well have happened under Mary. Without specific documentary or technical evidence, it's difficult to ascribe such alterations to so narrow a period. Caution must be exercised. For example, Eamon Duffy has stated that the secondary scheme on the currently ex situ Lessingham rood screen is Marian in date. However, the presence of the same workshop using some of the same stencils and tin relief patterns at Trunch, some 10 miles away, instead indicates a date nearer 1502, the date of the inscription on that screen. Under the agency of royal visitors, 1559, after Mary's death, was a time of widespread image destruction. Marian roods and those earlier examples which had been squirreled away, re-emerging under Mary, were burnt in great bonfires. For the first time, rood lofts were officially ordered to be removed, and it was under Elizabeth that the majority of rood lofts were taken down, although not always immediately. The partition between nave and chancel was to be retained, as made explicit in the Elizabethan order of the 10th of October 1561. It is perhaps for this reason, rather paradoxically, that England retained such a large number of screens as opposed to the continent, where the Lutheran and Calvinist Reformations respectively swept them away, although their popularity varied regionally throughout Europe. As appears to have been the case under Edward VI, the royal arms at the head of the rood screen became a familiar sight in parish churches under Elizabeth, as at Ludham. A number of roods and rood lofts must have survived into the 17th century, as both the 28th of August 1643 and May 1644 ordinance explicitly state their prohibition. The dating of the scratching of eyes and destruction of prayer clauses is, however, nigh on impossible. Technical study shows that Tudor screens can be identified with a degree of certainty due to a construction change in rood screen manufacture in East Anglia. Between 1485 and 1538, screen production was widespread and well established. Screen painting in the Tudor period can be seen to be both continuing a tradition and capable of adopting the latest continental fashions. However, the religious turmoil of the Reformation meant that rood lofts such as North Birmingham, finished only in 1536, were probably defaced only 10 years later, their lofts dismantled, their roods destroyed. Production ceased from 1547 and the accession of Edward VI, and the extensive dismantling and widespread iconoclasm date from this period. There was a brief Catholic revivalist moment under Mary between 1553 and 58, perhaps best exemplified in East Anglia at Ludham, but many parishes lacked the means to replace roods, lofts and screens, and many sculptures were replaced by cheap canvas at this date. Within the span of a couple of decades, it appears that the craft structures and traditions of rood screen carpentry and painting were fractured. While there's a general dichotomy between the insular, flat medieval paintings on rood screens and outward, courtly, up-to-date portraiture, it is perhaps not quite so clear-cut. From 1500, the painters of rood screens were far from insular, responding as they were to the latest continental prints. Made at about that date, within the first 20 years of Tudor rule, perhaps the portrait of Henry VII marks both the end of one tradition and the beginning of another. Thank you very much.